everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob. What do plant food, bath salts, and monkey dust all have in common? They are all names which have been given to cathinones over the years. This week we're going to be looking at the ACMD report, which has been recently published, looking at cathinones in the UK. So before we get into that, what are cathinones? Well, cathinones are a class of drug, a very wide class, contain a lot of different compounds. And their history is quite interesting. Cathinone itself is found in the cat plant. And cat is a plant native to parts of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And for centuries, it's been chewed because it has mild stimulant effects. It's similar to people in South America chewing coca leaves or use of caffeine amongst virtually the whole world. And its psychoactive component in the cat plant is this compound cathinone. And chewing cat leaves produces sort of mild stimulant effects, euphoria, alertness, sociability, and has a history of being used sort of social gatherings, business meetings, situations like students who want to stay awake, that sort of thing. But whilst cathinone is a natural compound found in plants, we've seen a rise in the last few years of synthetic cathinones or cathinone compounds which have had chemical groups on that cathinone structure altered. And the earliest one, which you might have heard of, is this compound called mephedrone. And this was actually first synthesized in 1929, but then it was largely forgotten about. And in the 2000s, rediscovered as a sort of legal high, if you like, an uncontrolled stimulant drug. Now, mephedrone is essentially a cathinone with a couple of methyl groups. It's 4-methyl-meth-cathinone. And this became popular, first appeared in Israel, and then spread across Europe, and became really big in the UK in the late 2000s. It was sold quite freely in quite a lot of places, had all sorts of names. So this is where things like plant food or bath salts were names that were associated with it. And it became a really big club drug, big on nights out, often used instead of using MDMA. And actually in 2009, it was actually found to be the fourth most popular drug in the UK. And that was after alcohol, cannabis and cocaine. So very quickly, it became a very, very popular compound. And the timings of this also coincided with a global shortage of MDMA. There was a large safrole shortage, which is a precursor compound for MDMA production. And so mephedrone very quickly filled the gap. But in April 2010, it was banned by the UK government. They reclassified it as a Class B drug. Its use dropped off quite quickly, but it didn't stop synthetic cathinones. All it did was it forced people who were synthesizing these compounds to start changing them. And that probably is what led to where we are now. So I've set the scene. Rebecca, why don't you take us through some of the stats in the ACMD report? It was quite a weighty document.
It's 125 pages long, so there's a lot of information in this report. So we're going to try and pick out some interesting bits to talk about today. So between March 2020 and March 2023, 71 different synthetic cathinones were detected, which is quite a lot. Mephedrone, which Rob mentioned earlier, is still the most commonly detected synthetic cathinone in the UK, followed by 4-CMC, MD-PHP, also known as monkey dust, alpha-PHP, and 3-MMC.
So CMC, chloromethcathinone,
Yeah.
MMC, methylmethcathinone. Quite a large number of very different compounds, all slight variations on that common cathinone structure.
Yeah, and this sort of mirrors what has been seen in Europe. The EMC DDA also have some stats on the sorts of cathinones that have been seized across Europe, and 3-chloromethcathinone, 4-chloromethcathinone, 3-methylmethcathinone, and alpha-PHP all make their top 5. So since the methadone ban in 2010, the usage of cathinones has decreased quite a bit. So in 2010 to 2011, in 16 to 59-year-olds, 1.3% of people were reporting cathinone use, and that's dropped to 0.1% in 2023 to 2024.
So even though there's this large number of cathinones which are seen, they make up a relatively low proportion of drug use.
Yeah.
So the market for cathinones really changed. It was originally a club drug sold as a legal high, and slowly these cathinones have changed where they're being used. They're now more commonly used by polydrug users. Some recent data in the report says that users of cathinones now are associated with either very high levels of deprivation or quite a lot of the homeless population. So they've certainly changed in terms of where they're being detected. There's quite a lot of regional differences as well, aren't there, Rebecca? A couple of hotspots, or one particular hotspot in the UK seems to be a lot of cathinone use in Stoke-on-Trent,
Interesting.
North Staffordshire. And in particular, that seems to be one particular cathinone or possibly a couple of different compounds.
So I do know MDPHP, also known as monkey dust, seems to be the most commonly detected synthetic cathinone in Stoke, and that seems to be like the hotspot cathinone.
And a lot of this market seems to be driven by a very, very low cost, isn't it? We're talking, described in the report, as maybe as low as £1.50 a dose.
So looking at synthetic cathinone seizures in the EU, as reported by the EMCDDA, there's been quite a dramatic increase in the quantity of synthetic cathinones that have been seized. So back in 2018, they seized 1,070 kilos of synthetic cathinones, and that's jumped up massively to 26,500 kilos of synthetic cathinones in 2022. And it does seem that a lot of these powders that are being seized are originating in India.
It looks like supply is kind of going up quite a bit, and potentially, therefore, that's kind of driving the price down, and possibly why we're seeing it, particularly amongst these more vulnerable populations who have maybe not got so much money to spend on drugs.
Yeah.
So why don't we look at the pharmacology of these compounds? As we've already said, there's not single cathinone, and they are all quite varied in terms of their chemical structure. And as a result, their pharmacology is quite variable, isn't it?
Yeah, so on the whole, cathinones, as I think we've mentioned previously, act as stimulants and increase the concentration of monoamines, which include dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline in synapses in the brain. So different cathinones can do this in different ways. One of the ways they can do this is block reuptake from the synapse back into the nerve cell by blocking DAT, NET, and SERT proteins, which act as transporters. So that's one way they can increase their concentration. And drugs such as alpha PVP and MDPHP work in this way. Other synthetic cathinones act by stimulating the release of these neurotransmitters, and methadone and methylone act in this way. They all have the same sort of endpoint effect of increasing the concentration of neurotransmitters in the synapse, but yeah, they do work in slightly different ways.
As a result, subjective effects of different cathinones can vary, and also the toxicity profiles, right? We've got these drugs that range from sort of an amphetamine-like kind of effect to some which act a bit more like MDMA and have got a sort of serotoninergic effect.
It's the main sort of effects you see with cathinones and synthetic cathinones are feelings of euphoria and empathy, increased alertness and talkativeness, which are kind of the desired effects of the drugs. But some negative effects that can occur include headache, heart palpitations, nausea, cold fingers, hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks. And in some cases, I believe it's been reported that some people have been affected with serotonin syndrome.
What about sort of adverse effects of use in terms of psychological effects? There's a lot of sort of paranoia reported and
Lots of strange behaviours.
strange behaviours. So there have been reports of perceived parasitosis, so situations where users feel like they've got bugs under their skin, effectively, that aren't there.
I know cathinones fatalities have also been reported, and these have often been attributed to hypothermia, hypertension, cardiac arrest, and serotonin syndrome, which you mentioned earlier.
So the kind of stimulant toxicity that we see associated with other stimulant type drugs. So Clearly, these drugs can be toxic to an individual, as we've discussed, but are there sort of wider societal harms that the report discusses?
So synthetic cathinones, along with other psychostimulants, can aggravate antisocial behaviours, increase aggression, and those sorts of disruptive behaviours, which can have an impact on communities and families close to those who are affected. And obviously, there's going to be a knock-on effect on the healthcare service and dealing with these people who rock up to A&E under the influence of synthetic cathinones.
So, as we said, this seems to be really quite variable in terms of there seems to be this geographic sort of anomaly with cathinones, doesn't it? In particular, very high prevalence in sort of North Staffordshire, Stoke-on-Trent.
It's quite interesting how there is that almost isolated population in Stoke affected by monkey dust. I don't know whether that's just to do with where the supply's coming in or whether there's like a hotspot of manufacturing monkey dust in that sort of region. I don't know.
It's probably not manufactured in that region, is it? If most of it's coming in from India.
In this report, they also highlight compounds of concern, and one of these being pyrrolidinocathinones. Compounds in this class include alpha-PHP, alpha-PIHP, MDPHP, alpha-PVP, and MDPV. And the structural change related to these cathinones makes them more lipophilic, and therefore there's this concern that they are penetrating into the brain more easily and having more of an effect. They also exhibit a very high potency at both the DAT and the NET transporter systems compared to other cathinones that we've seen, so they could therefore be potentially more toxic and cause more dangerous effects.
So what we've seen is this transition, haven't we, over the years from what started off as a natural plant compound, cathinone, to a very simple modification, mephedrone. And now we're seeing more and more chemical changes that seem to be pushing it more and more potent, more lipophilic, and therefore potentially increasing the harms. These pyrrolidinocathinones seem to have somewhat different effects, don't they, from the original sort of mephedrone? They've got less of that serotonin kind of action and are more sort of dopaminergic. So in other words, they're more similar in effect to methamphetamine than MDMA.
Yeah.
So what was the outcome of the report? What was the recommendation?
So the ACMD haven't recommended changing synthetic cathinones from a class B to a class A because they don't feel that it's going to make the sort of impact they want to see. It's just going to harm those who are already really vulnerable. But they are recommending changing to the wording to include those synthetic cathinones that have appeared in recent years that aren't covered under the current generic definition.
It's tough, isn't it, when you go all out and change the legislation on a drug to consider that it's potentially more harmful and therefore needs more proactive police involvement. You do risk penalising possession amongst already dependent users, and it is a really tricky balance to strike.
Another one of the recommendations in this report is to try and tackle homelessness, especially in those populations affected by synthetic cathinones, and directing them to the appropriate health and social care resources.
Yeah, so making sure we don't sort of criminalise people who are already vulnerable and instead actually sort of support them. So how does this affect us as toxicologists?
I think like with many drugs that we talk about on this podcast and many classes of drugs, it's making sure that we're looking for them, as there is that ever-changing drug market and seeing different ones. And if we're not detecting them, we're not reporting them, so we don't realise how big of a problem it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key takeaways really from this report is just the sheer number of cathinones that have now been reported or are being detected across the country, across Europe. Okay, so in conclusion then, synthetic cathinones are still here and it's looking like they're here to stay. They continue to evolve and we continue to see more and more potent variants emerging on the market. And they seem to come with higher risks, both for the individual, but also more social harms that can come with drug use. There's therefore a proposal that potentially we should look at increasing control of these, but the conclusion by the ACMD is that by doing so, we may just be driving the evolution of even more potent variants, and we risk criminalising people who are already vulnerable and already in need of support. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. I hope you've enjoyed listening this week. Do give us a like and follow on social media.
You can find us on Instagram at _tox_lab. We'd love to hear from you as always. Feel free to like or comment on any of our posts about any of our episodes. If you've got any suggestions for content you'd like us to cover in the future, feel free to send us a message. I hope you've all had a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.